Okay, so today's story is part of this series called Every Stone Tells a Story. And this particular one focuses on the Jewish war veterans. And, oops, there we go. So this walk was adapted from an historical walk given in the Sherazadic Cemetery as part of the Walks and Talks program that's coordinated by David Goss. So I did this way back in 2016. I've added a bit to it, so it's because we don't actually have to physically go anywhere. There was room to add a few more veterans to the list. So hopefully this won't be too long. So here's did you know that there are 3 veterans of the First World War buried in the cemetery and 31 veterans of the Second World War? One of those war veterans was the recipient of the Order of the British Empire. And only one typo, only one person from St. John actually died on active service. So we'll try and catch up with most of these people. So the first one, I'll just tell you as well, that when I was doing the research back for the exhibit in 2016, the exhibit was called Our Jewish Veterans Remembering Those Who Served. And the information that I used came from interviews with family members, information we had in our archives, digging around on the internet, which is always fun, and military records that I was able to request from Library and Archives Canada. And anybody can access those as long as either you can prove that the war veteran has been, I couldn't remember if it was 10 years or 20 years in their grave, or if you were a direct family. I think I had one that slipped in under the minimum years out, but they sent me the research anyway. So we'll start with the veterans of the First World War. So Maurice Abramson actually came from Boston and had served in the United States Army. I don't know a whole lot about what he was involved with while he served, but we do know that he suffered from shell shock, or what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. His connection to St. John was that he married Alice Isaacs, who was the daughter of Israel and Carrie Hart Isaacs. So a descendant of those original families in the city. He was a lawyer in Boston, and when he retired, the Abramsons came back to St. John and lived on Coburg Street. And the only other thing I really know about him is that he wrote a book of poetry, and he used the pseudonym of Sergeant Chubb. So the next one I have, and you're going to hear some extra noise on this one because I have the wrong notes in my book about Samuel Fainer. But he served in the Canadian Army from 1915 to 1919. And he enlisted in Ottawa, where I think he was living at the time. And he was part of the Canadian Overseas Expeditionary Force. He was in the 77th Battalion and the 3rd Field Battery. He shipped out to England on the SS California in February of 1916. And then the following month was on his way to France. He did not return to Canada until July of 1919. And part of his service involved being a baker. And so he was baking for the soldiers, and he was stationed in Boulogne, Staples, and Calais. And after the war, he came to St. John, where he ran the St. John Rye Bakery on Prince Edward Street. His son, Frank, who is not buried in St. John, but I'll just add this as an interesting aside, had enlisted in the Royal Air Force for the Second World War. And there were a couple of newspaper accounts, one where we learned that he was part of the evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940. And another incident where he had to bail out of his plane when it caught on fire, and he was rescued by a British ship. He did survive the war, but he spent the last part of the war as a prisoner of war after being shot down over Africa. And then he went to live in South Africa after the war was over. Wow. Ernest Gilbert enlisted on Partridge Island out in the city harbor on the 12th of October in 1917. and was part of the number 9 siege battery. And he sailed to England in February of 1918 and was then attached to the Royal Flying Corps, which was the predecessor of the Royal Air Force. Much of the record that I got from him from Library and Archives Canada included medical reports. And it would appear from the reasons why he was going to visit the doctors is that he liked the ladies, shall we say, but perhaps not the right sort. He did return to Canada in July of 1919. His father, Harris Gilbert, had a secondhand goods store on Mill Street. And then Ernest Gilbert went on to work at Duval's on Waterloo Street with the Pikowskis. So Major Frank Boyaner is the one person who did not return from the war. And the stone that you see here, which is in the Boyaner plot in the cemetery, was erected by the family, but Dr. Boyaner's remains are actually in the Brookwood Military Cemetery in Surrey, England. And he did not die from anything in battle. He picked up some sort of an illness that did him in. He did have a war bride, Hazel Morris. And after his death, she was given the Memorial Cross as the widows were treated. And when she came to St. John after the war, spent a year on Elliott Row with the Boyaner family and left the Memorial Cross behind with the Boyaner family. So before the war, Frank Boyaner had a dental practice first on Germain Street and then around the corner onto 63 King Street. He joined the non-permanent active militia well ahead of the beginning of the war and was already a lieutenant in the Canadian Army Dental Corps by September 1939 when the war started. He was the district dental officer for Military District Number 7, which included St. John. And he also was the dental officer for the 14th Field Ambulance, also based in St. John. And that particular operation was headed up by Dr. Tansman. In 1941, Dr. Boyaner went overseas to England as part of the 1st Canadian Fighter Squadron. He was posted at training bases and then was sent with the Dental Corps to Malta, followed the Army through the campaign in Sicily, and then spent an entire year in Italy. And throughout the war, he was sending postcards back to St. John to his nephew, Dan Ellman, and of course, focusing on things that would be of interest to a boy of 10 or 11 or 12 years old. So a lot of stories about airplanes. And one of the photographs we have in the collection has Dr. Boyaner as part of an honor guard that was in England that was sent out to receive King George VI. And in the photo, there's a Polish officer in a Hurricane aircraft as part of that fly past. So there were accounts in the St. John newspapers of Dr. Boyaner's death. And one of the headlines is Dental Corps officer dies at 47 overseas. Major Frank Boyaner is mourned, no details in message. So he was listed as a sudden passing. And the initial reports didn't really say what he died of. However, when they did have burial service in England, his brother-in-law, Maury Ellman, was able to be there. And the service was led by Rabbi Gershon Levi, who was the military chaplain. There were, as part of the people attended at the funeral, there was 3 Canadian colonels, 6 lieutenant colonels, other officers, 8 sergeants from the St. John unit acted as pallbearers. And there was even had a fly past where the plane dipped its wings as it flew past. So, but at this point, they believe that his death was due to an infection that he contracted in Italy. So that's Dr. Boyaner. So his brother-in-law, Morris Ellman, had of course also served and was also in the Canadian Dental Corps. He had trained as a dental technician at Bodie University in New York, but had come back to St. John after his training and was working with his father, working in film distribution and in the family shoe repair business on Main Street. And after the war, he went back into film distribution, this time in partnership with his son, Dan. And Maury Ellman had enlisted in October 1939 and stayed on as a member of the reserves until the 1960s. So for part of his war service, he was posted in Winnipeg, where he attended the Canadian School of Army Administration. And he was sent overseas from 1944 to 1945, and he was attached to the Royal Canadian Air Force. And then his other brother-in-law, Norman Smith, I guess his wife's brother-in-law, had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and went into a clerical role and was enlisted from 1941 to 1944 and was discharged as medically unfit at that point. But he had been involved in the film business before the war. And in fact, at the time of his enlistment, he was managing the King's Theatre in Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. When he came back, he opened Norman's Tobacco Store in King Street and had that until he retired in the 1970s. The Meltzer family plot, and the Meltzers were very involved during the Second World War, starting with William, or I guess he was Big Bill Meltzer. And he had joined the Zombies, non-permanent active militia in 1942, and then went on to the regular army in 1944. And he went overseas in 1944 and was in Belgium, Holland, and Germany, where he was performing general duties. He was also involved with an engineering corps as part of his training. And one of the things that he did that the only member of the community that I'm aware of that did this is he volunteered for mustard gas tests in Suffield, Alberta. So he was sprayed with gas on one arm, and then he was also asked to walk through a field of gas. When he came back to St. John, he went into business, first with Zab's Menswear on Mill Street, and then Bill's Tobacco Store in Prince Edward Street through the 1960s and 1970s. His sister Lillian had actually left St. John already, was living in New York when war broke out, but she took a leave of absence from her job. Excuse me. And enlisted in the Canadian Women's Army Corps, and she was a member of that from 1942 to 1946. And she was the secretary for the Jewish chaplain, Rabbi Samuel Cass in England. She also got involved with child survivors of the Holocaust, so orphan children. So she organized a Hanukkah party in 1945 for them. And she also did correspondence with family of these children in other parts of Europe, in Canada, and the United States to try and reunite these orphans with somebody in their family. And she maintained contact with many of these children afterwards. She did eventually move to Florida, where she was involved with the Jewish war veterans and was active with veterans units across the United States. The youngest member of the Meltzer family, Gar, enlisted first in the Army and then transferred to the Air Force. His initial training was at Camp Sussex, just up the road from St. John, and then he went on to Camp Woodstock from 1940 to 1942. And then he became an officer training instructor in Calgary. He had hoped to serve overseas, but he was did such a good job of training the men that they decided they needed to keep him as an instructor for most of the war. Many years later, he was the founder and commanding officer of the Atlantic Post No. 4 of the Jewish War Veterans of Canada. And in this role, he compiled numerous lists of Atlantic Canadian War veterans, organized annual Remembrance Day events at the synagogue, at the cenotaph, and laid any number of wreaths across Canada and the United States in honor and in memory of the war veterans. He also maintained an enormous correspondence with individuals and organizations that advocated for veterans. And of course, many of you may remember him as Boy Scout and Cub leader in the Jewish community and as the owner of Gar's Diner and Variety Store in West St. John. Most of their customers came from the ships. And he had a canteen counter there, and the menu was printed in any number of languages so that you could order a hamburger or a hot dog or fish and chips in whatever language was yours. And he was also a traveling salesman. And the next plot over in the Garson family plot is Lionel April, which most of you would remember as the owner of Robin's Drugstore. But before he came to St. John, he had enlisted in the Air Force, and he enlisted while he was still living in Toronto. He went overseas and served in England and in West Africa from 1941 to 1944. So he was among those who fought in the Battle of Britain, and he was in active combat in Europe and in Northern Africa. And he met his wife, Rita Garson, when he was billeted in the Garson family home in St. John. And they married in 1945 when his service came to an end. And then if we travel through the cemetery to the opposite end of the cemetery to the Green Heart plot, there are two members of the Green family who served, Lewis Green and his brother Nathan Green. So Lewis Green, and these are descendants of that original Green family that came to St. John in 1859 and had Greens at the head of King Street. So Lewis Green enlisted in the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve in 1939 and served until August of 1945. He finished his career as a leading signalman. So he was in charge of the signal branch on board the ship and was part of the British liaison staff when he was posted in Newfoundland. And he served on many different ships, excuse me, including the Stadacona, the Venture, the Avalon, the St. Hyacinth, the Trois Rivières, the Saskatchewan, the Peregrine. So most of his service was in Canada, Newfoundland, the North Atlantic, and then the English Channel. So after the war, when he came back, he was the manager and owner of Green's Tobacco Store. His brother, Nathan Green, there he is, was a corporal in the Canadian Army, served his entire time in Canada, and was in charge of inventory and delivering materials by truck. Sorry about this, I'm getting over a cold. So he was also involved with Green's Store and then expanded into Green's Restaurant next door and then Green's Catering. And then he went into the shoe business with his son, Stephen, with Greenlee Shoe. Their brother-in-law, Louis Citron, served for 3 months. He did enlist, but received a medical discharge. So did not spend a lot of time in service, but still deserves recognition. And then as we work our way back up the hill, we find most of the rest of the veterans. So starting with Max Bransblow, who did serve in the Royal Canadian Air Force and was a wireless electrical mechanic. He was posted in Sussex, New Brunswick at the time that he married Ida Gus in May 1942. And although he was supposed to have gone overseas, he ended up staying in Canada for the duration of the war. We'll talk about him again next week when we talk about the families who had stores on Main Street, because his grocery store was on Main Street North. And he was impacted not once, but twice by the urban renewal that took place in that neighborhood in the 1960s. Lillian Zatzman was in the Canadian Women's Army Corps from 1944 to 1945. Was posted in Edmonton, where she was a secretary. Her husband was Saul Harris, who was a Holocaust survivor. And when they got resettled in St. John, she helped her husband with Harris Men's and Boys Wear on Union Street. Charles Zatzman joined the non-permanent active militia of Canada in 1938, and then enrolled in the Royal Canadian Air Force in March of 1943. So he was listed as an aircraftsman in terms of his rank, was posted in Quebec and in Halifax, and was serving basically as a clerk accountant. He was discharged in September 1945 on medical grounds, not because he was sick, but because his father needed him to return and run the family business, McCormick and Zatzman. And this was a company that was shipping fish and other food commodities around the world. Sidney Grossweiner was also in the Air Force. and again, a short service from May 1943 to August 1944, where he was listed as an aircraftsman, and he was working as a mechanic, posted to St. John, Montreal, Ottawa, and Halifax. And he was discharged early on compassionate grounds. He married Ella Lesser just 2 weeks before he enlisted. So cutting it close, I think. And before the war, he was a clerk for Basson's and then Margolian stores. And then after the war, he opened his own store, New Mode Ladies Apparel. And then after the store closed, he went into the life insurance business. Mark Reese's story is a little bit different than everyone else's because he was actually from England. He was born in Manchester, England in 1914, and he did not arrive in Canada until January 1949, when he came to take on the position of Chief Financial Officer for Manchester, Robertson and Allison, where he worked for 20 years. His war diary is part of the museum's collection. He enlisted with the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve in December 1939 and was called up for active service on July the 15th, 1940. Because he had vision limitations, he was accepted for ground training as a wireless operator, which he completed in March 1941. He was then sent to Egypt in the spring of 1941 and was part of the war that was going on in the Western Desert until 1943, and was then sent on to India and was part of the campaign along the India-Burma border until March 1945. And he was not returned to England until May of 1945. But he had to serve another year before he could secure his discharge. He did come to St. John. He made many friends in the community, and he was still very interested in radio. So he did have a ham radio license, but he did never marry. So came alone and continued that way. Lawrence Earl Weasel, his experience was also a little bit different. So in the early 1940s, he had been hired as a photographer by the Montreal Standard newspaper. And because he could both write and take photographs, he was sent across Canada to write photo features. And then from 1943 to 1945, he was a war correspondent in Northwestern Europe. So embedded with the troops near the front lines is not a new thing when they talk about war today. He said he changed his name legally to Lawrence Earl when he was advised by the army that if he was captured by the Germans, his Jewish surname Weasel, he ran the risk of being shot. We've also been told that he did 2 wartime broadcasts for CBC Radio. And he published widely. So the Montreal Standard, he also published stories at various times in the National Geographic, the Saturday Evening Post, Maclean's, the Star Weekly. His wife, Jane Armstrong, was also a journalist and war correspondent, not as embedded quite as closely into the army as he would have been. And they spent most of their working career in London, England, but they visited Grand Bay during the summer months. So just on the other side of the woods from Pamdenack until they moved there permanently in the 1990s. His brother Clint Weasel, who we've also met in other walks, served in the Royal Canadian Air Force from May 1943 to October 1945. He never did make it overseas. I'm not sure exactly where he was posted in Canada, but when he came back after the war, he became one of the city's most prominent and successful portrait photographers. So he opened his studio in 1947 over the shoe store. And his portraits were of individuals, families, weddings, many of his subjects coming from the Jewish community. So some of you may have some of his work in your own collections. And some of the people that he photographed included Casey Irving and Miller Britton. He later retired from photography, went into life insurance, and then had a third career as a farmer near Norton. Morton Pikowski was also in the Air Force. That seems to be where most of the men ended up serving. I was in the Air Force for about a year and a half, and was posted in Quebec and Ontario as grounds crew and a wireless mechanic. And then, of course, when he came back, was on the staff at Duval's on Waterloo Street. Milton Basson, also in the Air Force for 2 years, from 1943 to 1945, as an aircraftsman, and was stationed in Toronto, in Alberta, and in Manitoba. And he enlisted for ground duties and was a clerk accountant in the offices. And he took an early discharge on compassionate grounds and came home to take over the management of his father's store, Basson's on King Street at the corner of Germain. Building's not there anymore, but I have a picture of the building somewhere. Jack Knitsky was in the Canadian Army. So he joined up in March of 1943 and was part of the Ordnance Corps. He was trained in Fredericton and in Berryfield, which is near Kingston, Ontario. And then was sent overseas and served in England and in France, where he was a clerk and a storeman. So keeping track of things. So before and after the war, he was a clothing manufacturer. Worked with Maritime Cloak, which was a business that had been started by his father. David Lubin enlisted and served as a sergeant in the Canadian Army. Made it as far as Woodstock, New Brunswick, where he was attached to supply and services, and spent most of the war keeping track of supplies. He had actually grown up in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, and did not move to St. John until 1939. Most of you would probably remember him as the owner of Lubin's Shoes on Charlotte Street. And after that closed, he became an investment advisor, and for many years helped as a lay reader in the synagogue. Bernie Bloom was enlisted under the National Resources Mobilization Act. So he joined up in December 1941 and was attached to the Canadian Army by March of 1942, and was posted with the Royal Canadian Engineers at the Canadian Infantry Training Center in Utopia, New Brunswick, so near St. George. He spent the duration of his Army life as an office clerk in Penfield and earned 50 cents per day as a sergeant. Before the war, he had been a sales and accounts clerk at Barney's department store and for Jacobson and Everett, both on Main Street. And then after the war, he opened his own store, Bernie's Clothing. And he had that store until the store burned down in 1971, and then went on to work at MRA's and then at the Ideal store. And he was very involved, of course, with the congregation and was the Gabbai of the Havre Kadisha for more than 25 years. Jack Gus enlisted in the Royal Canadian Medical Corps in September 1939 and served until May of 1944. He was posted first at Camp Sussex for training and then sent overseas on the 1st of August of 1941. In London, he served as an ambulance driver, so picking up the people who were wounded in the bombings in London, so picking up people impacted by the Blitz. He was also on guard duty, operated the petrol pumps, and was a clerk in the petrol office. The stress of all the different tasks he was doing, particularly the ambulance driving, led to his hospitalization for a nervous breakdown, which got him posted into the payroll office from 1942 to 1943. His main claim to fame in the Canadian Army was having the Army's largest pair of feet, size 15. I could not even begin to imagine in those days what it would have taken to find a pair of size 15 boots that were in keeping with the Army uniform. He also kept a scrapbook about his war service. And when he came back to St. John after the war, he worked in the scrap metal business, first with his brother and then with his own company, Jack Gus and Company on Gilbert's Lane. He was also involved in the Progressive Conservative Party. And he was instrumental in securing pensions for war veterans some 50 years after the war. And I think this is him in uniform in front of his house on Elliott Row. Dr. Joseph Tansman had studied medicine at McGill University. And when he came back to St. John around 1930, he set up a general practice on Main Street. And the anecdotes were that he only saw 1 or 2 patients during the first 2 days in practice. But of course, things picked up over time. During the Second World War, he took a leave of absence from his medical practice to join the Canadian Army. And he served in St. John and overseas with the 14th Field Ambulance Brigade. While the unit was preparing to go overseas in 1940, it was presented with an ambulance by local businesses in St. John. And Dr. Tansman and this unit crossed through Europe as the war progressed. As the war drew to an end, he was posted near Berlin, Germany. He was awarded the OBE, Officer of the Order of the British Empire, with the following recommendation of Canada's top military officers. Quote, through the ability of this officer to apply his sound knowledge and mastery of his job, all wounded of 7 Canadian Infantry Brigade Group were evacuated quickly and with the maximum degree of comfort. This officer has always devoted much time and attention to every detail, and as a result, many lives of Canadian soldiers were saved. So after he came back from the Army in 1946, he chose to practice obstetrics. So a little more study. And then as far as we can figure out, he delivered more than 8,000 babies in St. John, probably including almost everybody in the Jewish community. He was also on the Board of Commissioners of the General Hospital. He was the president of the St. John Medical Society, was involved with the school board and with everything within the Jewish community as well. Sonny Smith was one of the first to enlist from St. John. So I think he enlisted around the 15th of September, 1939, and served right through the war until October 1945. He was discharged from the Royal Canadian Air Force with the rank of warrant officer, and he was sent overseas in February 1940 and spent most of the war in England with a short assignment in Algeria. He served as an aerial gunner until he developed a heart murmur and was then assigned to land duties. He married when he came back to St. John, so he married Ann Coven in January 1950, and they ran Sonny's Soda Bar on Union Street for more than 30 years. Morris Holtzman went into the Canadian Army in 1942 and was there until 1945 and served as a private. As a single man, he was much more likely to be drafted than men that had wives and children. So he spent most of his service overseas working in an office near the front, but not so close that he had to fight anybody. He never did speak about his experiences when he came back to St. John, and he just went right back to work at the Sunray store where he had been before the war. Isidore Davis, I.J. Davis, joined the Corps of Military Staff Clerks in the Canadian Army, and he was posted to the Barrack Green Armory on Broad Street in St. John for his entire service. And unlike most of the other men who served, he was able to return each night to the family home at 42 Spring Street to have dinner with the family and sleep in his own bed. His children shared a story with me that the men had pulled straws to see who would go overseas at the end of the war. But as it turned out, none of the men ever did go overseas. Not sure if the story is true or not, but there it is. He married Ruth Godwin after the war, and they had their 5 children. He worked for most of his career as a film distributor for United Artists. And after the war, he was also co-owner with Lou Michelson of the Dog and Suds. I think it was the first drive-through restaurant in St. John on Rossay Avenue. And he later managed the family dry cleaners in the Lancaster Mall. I will apologize for the snowy picture in this case. It was the one gravestone I didn't have a picture of. So I couldn't get any closer because the snow was knee deep. So David Shepard, registered under the National Resources Mobilization Act in 1935. And then again in 1940, when everybody was being registered for national on a national level. And so they could find people for conscription. So he enlisted in the Air Force and was served as an aircraftsman and then as an acting sergeant. All of his postings were in Canada. He was at a training school and then a records office, and then was working with the repatriation office, so processing the servicemen as they came home. And came to St. John after the war, working on the Fabric Center, first on Main Street, and then later moved to Union Street because of urban renewal. And after he died in 1967, the store was continued by his wife, Ethel. So Zelig Fine served in the Royal Ordnance Corps of the Canadian Army from 1943 to 1945. He was also posted for most of the war in St. John at the No. 7 Ordnance Depot and at the Canadian Army Training Center, and was working primarily in the storeroom. And then after the war, had a secondhand store on Dock Street. Herbert Tobin joined the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve. He was one of only a handful of Jewish men from the community who joined the Navy. So he joined in 1943 and was on service until December the 28th, 1945, as an able seaman. And he served on a number of different ships, including the Montcalm, the Cornwallis, the Stadacona, the Paisley, the Avalon, the Peregrine, and the Scotian, and the St. Thomas. So among the things he was responsible for, managing the ship's rigging and the steering, and also as a gunner. When he came back to St. John, he worked for a short time in the Star Ice Cream Parlor, which was the business owned by his in-laws on Main Street West. And he had married Judy Coven. And then he later opened Tobin's Tobacco Store on Union Street and had that store until he died in 1955. Now this guy, Joseph Birnbaum, had come to St. John as a transient and had died at the Salvation Army Hospital. However, they realized that he had served during the Second World War. So his gravestone was placed by the Department of Veterans Affairs. And he had served in Montreal for a year in the Ordnance Corps from 1944 to 1945. So he had in charge of the storeroom and general duties. And we have a file of correspondence in the archives going back and forth with the Department of Veterans Affairs to arrange to pay for Birnbaum's burial and for his grave marker. And the last one I have, last but not least, was Murray Korber. So his father, Israel Korber, had been involved with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which had helped many of the families coming from Eastern Europe from the 1890s to the 1920s. So translation services and all that sort of thing. So Murray Korber had joined the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps in September 1939 and served until 1944 when he was discharged as medically unfit. He started out with the No. 14 Field Ambulance, and then he was posted to different hospitals, including the Howes Lake Military Hospital, the St. James Street Military Hospital, and then he was posted to the Fredericton Internment Camp Hospital and the Utopia Military Hospital. So the first two hospitals were, of course, in St. John, and then the Fredericton Internment Camp posting was from 1942 to 1943. And this was the internment camp located in Ripples, New Brunswick, about 30 miles east of Fredericton. This was a former lumbering camp that was turned into military camp during the war, and there were two time periods in the camp. So from 1940 to 1941, there were 700 Jewish men placed in that camp. These were Jewish men who had fled from Nazi-occupied Europe, had gone to England, but because they were carrying German passports, were seen as possible spies. So were rounded up and interned. And then these men, in 1941, some were released and helping with the war effort. Others were moved to other camps. And the camp in Ripples was turned into a camp for German and Italian prisoners of war found along the coast, because of course there was boat activity and people would wash up or turn up with trying to plan bombing campaigns or something, I'm not quite sure. So Murray Korber had clerical duties, and he was also doing some translation for the letters that the men were writing. He had hoped to transfer to the censorship staff of internment operations, but didn't quite qualify for that. Let's see if I have anything else on him. So before the war, Murray Korber had been a musician and orchestra leader and had been involved with film distribution. After the war, he took up a career as a postal clerk in St. John, and then late in life, he moved to Maine. So, as I said, I think that's my last one. It's going a little bit quicker. So, as always, thank you for the walk. I'm hoping you'll have some comments, suggestions, and memories that you can share about this or other things that I may have touched on in this presentation. And I'll just remind you that next week's walk will also be based on the cemetery, but we'll look at the Jewish merchants who were on Main Street in the city's North End. And that's March 22nd. And on March the 29th, we'll have something a little more dramatic, murder, illness, and accidents. So people who got to the cemetery in perhaps a bit untimely fashion. And then we'll have a break for Passover and then come back again on April the 19th for the last walk on Summer Street. Still haven't written that one yet, but I have the outline. So we are making progress. And I am still working on the bar mitzvah exhibit that we're going to have starting in May. I have been able to turn up some memories and invitations and photographs, and other memorabilia, but if anyone here has anything else to contribute to that, I will be happy to have it.